A father and son are estranged. They've not spoken to each other for 10 years. Two old friends used to do everything together. Now they've had a falling out. They have nothing to do with one another. A couple who was once married, happily married, now cannot stand to be in the same room with one another. Neighbors are in a row over a tree that needs to be cut down. Who's going to pay for it? Who's responsible? Business associates who once labored together, supporting one another, now find their only communication that of a courtroom and between their lawyers. These are all examples of the tragedy of estrangement. Human relationships that have broken down. Where there once had been friendliness, where there once had been love, there is now a wall, a rift, a separation. It can happen among family members, among friends, among business partners. It can happen in neighborhoods, at schools. It can happen on sports teams. It can happen in musical dramas and in the arts, that anywhere we find human relationships, there is unfortunately the tragedy of estrangement. These once great relationships now broken, now torn down, and there's a wall between two people who once had so much in common, who once had so much fondness and love for one another. Well, this morning we want to hear what God has to say about the tragedy of estrangement and how He has given to us the blessing of reconciliation. So if you would, please take a Bible and turn to 2 Samuel chapter 14. 2 Samuel chapter 14. It's page 224. In the Bibles the church provides, there's one in the rack in front of you or underneath your seat. Again, our goal is to hear God's word on the issue of the estrangement of relationships. And so we want to listen to what He has to say. As you're turning, let me give you the backstory that gets us to what we're about to look at here in 2 Samuel 14. A few years before this event takes place, David, who's king of Israel, turns his back on the Lord and engages in an adulterous affair with a woman named Bathsheba and goes so far as to have her rightful husband murdered, a man named Uriah the Hittite. God, in His great mercy, is willing to forgive David and does forgive David. However, there are consequences to sin, and one of the consequences to David's sin is that I think perhaps his children watched their father do this and were emboldened themselves to engage in immoral behavior. And it's not very long after David's sin with Bathsheba and her husband Uriah the Hittite that David's son Amnon sexually assaults his daughter Tamar. It's a story that we looked at last week. Now, we noticed last week that David did nothing. He did nothing about this. Perhaps it's because he felt after his own sin that he lacked the moral authority. I mean, who is he to come and say something to Amnon after he himself has committed a sexual sin? He's wrong about that, by the way. God had forgiven him. God had left him as king of Israel. God is the source of David's moral authority. He had all the moral authority he needed to come and to say something to Amnon. But he chose not to. In that void, in that absence of David doing anything, of David saying anything, of David even addressing the situation, another of David's sons, a man named Absalom, decides to take matters into his own hands. For 2 years, Absalom plots against his brother Amnon. And at the end of the 2 years, he executes the plot and has Amnon killed. We pick up our story at the end of actually chapter 13, verse 37. After Absalom kills his brother Amnon, it says, verse 37, Absalom fled and went to Talmai, son of Ammihud, the king of Geshur. But King David mourned for his son every day. That is Amnon he's mourning for. He's mourning for his oldest child who was murdered. Every day he's sad for him. Verse 38, after Absalom fled and went to Geshur, he stayed there 3 years. And the spirit of the king longed to go to Absalom, for he was consoled concerning Amnon's death. So what's happening here? Absalom kills Amnon. Again, David seems to do nothing. He doesn't find Absalom to bring him to justice. He doesn't go find Absalom to offer him forgiveness. He just simply ignores the situation. Absalom runs off to go live with his maternal grandparents. And there's just simply a rift and estrangement. And for 3 years, David and his son Absalom have nothing to do with one another. Now, one of the reasons is because David is mourning for his oldest child, Amnon, the one who's been murdered. And every day he is grieved for the fact that he's lost his oldest son. But at some point at the end of the 3 years, we are told that David was consoled regarding Amnon's death. And at that point, he longs to have a relationship again with this son who he is estranged from. But unfortunately, what follows is a classic case of how not to go about the process of reconciliation. And we want to learn this morning from what David did wrong, so that in the areas in which we are experiencing estrangement, we might be able to do it right. And there are 2 fundamental mistakes that David makes as he goes about wanting to overcome the estrangement he has with his son Absalom. Pick up the story in chapter 14, verse 1. Joab, who's second in command to David in the kingdom, son of Zeruiah, knew that the king's heart longed for Absalom. So Joab sent someone to Tekoa and had a wise woman brought from there. He said to her, pretend you are in mourning, dress in mourning clothes, and don't use any cosmetic lotions. Act like a woman who has spent many days grieving for the dead. Then go to the king and speak these words to him. And Joab put the words in her mouth. So at this point, Joab is sending this woman to David with a made-up story. And the woman goes to David to tell him this made-up story. It didn't happen to her, but it has been planned by Joab. This story has been planned, and she shares it with David. We pick up the story in verse 6. The woman is speaking. I, your servant, had 2 sons. They got into a fight with each other in the field, and no one was there to separate them. One struck the other and killed him. Now the whole clan has risen up against your servant. They say, hand over the one who struck his brother down so that we may put him to death for the life of his brother whom he killed. Then we will get rid of the heir as well. They would put out the only burning coal I have left, leaving my husband neither name nor descendant on the face of the earth. So the woman has this made-up story that Joab has made up for. She's a great actress. She's come and presents it as if she's lost one of her children. Now, it's very clear that this story is meant to parallel what's happened in David's life. David has a son, Absalom, who's killed another son, Amnon. And the question is, what about justice for Absalom? Is he going to be killed as well? And so Joab comes and has this woman tell this story about supposedly she has 2 boys. And one of her boys kills another one of the boys. And now the whole town wants to kill the murderer. And she says, well, now I'll be gone too. I'll have 2 sons that are gone. Now, David doesn't realize the trap that's being set for him. He thinks this really has happened to this woman. And so he offers his judgment, and his judgment is, no, you should be merciful to the son who executed the murder. Now, she keeps drawing him in. She says, are you sure? And she gets David to absolutely commit, yes, that boy's life should be spared. And then she springs the trap. Verse 12. Then the woman said, let your servant speak a word to my lord the king. Speak, he replied. The woman said, why then have you devised a thing like this against the people of God? When the king says this, does he not convict himself? For the king has not brought back his banished son. Like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be recovered, so we must die. But God does not take away life. Instead, he devises ways so that a banished person may not remain estranged from him. And in these wise woman's words, we see David's first mistake that he made. And the first mistake that David made in this rift that he has with his son Absalom is that David does nothing. David does nothing. He's just sitting in Jerusalem, and for 3 years there's no contact with his son Absalom whatsoever. Now listen, we sit here and think, but Absalom killed his son. Isn't it Absalom's job to come to David? Isn't it Absalom's job to take the initiative to come and say, hey, look, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. I mean, after all, if it wasn't for Absalom, there wouldn't have been this rift in the relationship. We think the same way today. We think, well, that person left our small group. Shouldn't they be the ones to come back to us? Shouldn't they be the ones to try to reestablish the relation? We didn't kick them out. They chose to leave our small group. Or maybe you're thinking, well, my brother stole my girlfriend. Shouldn't he be the one to come to me? It's not my job to go to him to try to patch up the relationship. He's the one who did this thing. Or maybe we think, well, that company fired me. I didn't want to leave. They're the ones that ended my job. Why is it my job to go to the boss and have him and try to restore the relationship with him? Shouldn't they be the one who come to me? And humanly speaking, yes, that's what we would say. But unfortunately, we would be wrong, and the woman brings it up. She says, but that's not how God works. God's not the one who waits for us to come to him. She says, God seeks out ways to overcome estrangement and banish children. And of all people, David should know this. Remember after David sinned with Bathsheba, when he turned his back on God, the God who had blessed him, the God who had done all this stuff for him, the God who had been so kind for him, and David basically said, look, I don't care about you. I want to go sleep with that woman, and I want to make things happen for myself. And he says, I don't care about you, God, and it establishes a rift in the relationship. And for a while, God and David have nothing to do with each other. But who's the one that takes the initiative to heal the rift? It's God. God is the one who sends the prophet Nathan to David. God is the one who says, look, you are estranged from me. David sinned against God. He says in his own words, against you, Lord, have I done this evil in your sight. But God doesn't wait for David to come back to him. God seeks out David and tries to come and get him. After all, this is how we became Christians, isn't it? We became Christians not because we sought God, but because God sought us. A week ago, this past Friday, so 9 days ago, I was sitting with a couple at a coffee house whom God had been seeking to establish a relationship with, to bring them to faith. It was amazing to hear their story. God had set everything in motion to bring this couple into a saving relationship with himself. First of all, he had given them a daughter who had been earnestly praying for them every day. Second, he had placed a couple from Calvary Church as their next door neighbor, who unbeknownst to them had also been praying daily for them to come to faith. God had then allowed the husband to have a serious medical condition for which there wasn't a lot. The doctors were they needed some help, and so the daughter was able to say, hey, Dad, why don't you come to Calvary and allow us to pray over you, allow the pastors to pray over you at the church. And so the dad came along with the mom, and in the middle of the prayer meeting, Jesus showed up in a very powerful way. The wife even had a vision of Jesus coming to her. Now, she didn't have a vision of her going up to heaven to find him. Jesus was coming down from heaven through the Spirit to find her. And in the vision, he's reaching out his hands to her, offering her reconciliation to bring her back to himself. That's what God does. God seeks us out. None of us are here. and believers in Jesus because we went and found him. It's because God took the initiative to come find us. Now look what God says to us. Listen to Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 5. Therefore, speaking to you and I, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift. He's talking about if you're in the middle of prayer and you realize that somebody has something against you, stop praying. Leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer the gift. Now compare that with what Jesus says in Matthew 18. If your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault, just between the two of you. If he listens to you, you have won your brother over. Now look at these two passages side by side, both from the book of Matthew, both from the lips of Jesus. In the first case, if your brother has something against you, go. In the second case, if you have something against your brother, go. It doesn't matter whether you have been sinned against or you are the person doing the sinning. Who's responsible for taking the first step? We are. If you are hearing the words of Jesus this morning, he's saying to you, it's your job. Whether you were the one who was offended or you were the one who did the offending, it doesn't matter. In either case, it's our job to take the initiative. It was not Absalom's job to come to David. It was David's job to go to Absalom. That's what God did for David, and that's what God requires of David to do for his son. It's also what God is asking us to do. You say, well, how many times am I supposed to do? I've tried that. I've tried to reestablish the relationship. I've tried to fix things. How many times am I supposed to do that? 7 times? 77 times? Or more? Whatever it takes.